What up, people? I'm back with another video, and this time I'm talking about the Sega Saturn. And the idea of this video is that I'm intentionally breaking it up into two parts. Each part is going to cover two games of the system, and this one, first up, is Virtual Fighter 2, which when I had a Sega Saturn, I thought this game was so amazing. Um, and the main reason I'm doing this, and I'm going to call this little short series Saturn Days, to talk about the Sega Saturn, of course. The Sega Saturn turned 22, not 22, it turned 20 years old. It was released on November 22nd, 1994, in Japan. We didn't see it stateside until May 11th, 95, and of course, that was basically the beginning of the end for Sega Saturn, and I probably will talk about that more in the video. Um, Now, one of the few games that I had for, or I think this was probably the only game I had for the Sega Saturn, I don't really remember. Um, this is definitely the only game I remember playing. Virtual Fighter 2, which, if I'm not mistaken, it might have been a release title. I know Virtual Fighter 1 and Virtual Fighter 2 were both released for the Sega 32X, or it might have just been the first Virtual Fighter. But the Sega Saturn was basically no stranger to the Virtual Fighter franchise. On top of the Virtual Fighter games, there was Virtual Fighter 2 Remix, which I think it had a couple more characters, a few more stages, and I think it fixed some of the issues with the original Virtual Fighter 2. I'm playing the original Virtual Fighter 2. I don't have Remix or any of the other Virtual Fighter titles that were released on the Sega Saturn. And honestly, I look back at this game and I'm like, wow, uh, we have come a long way graphically in terms of games, and you know, the floaty jumping is, I think, is a killer to me. Just for the fact that, you know, now that I'm playing it, I'm used to other games like Tekken. And I'm not talking like PlayStation 3 Tekken. I'm talking about like Tekken 1, Tekken 2, uh, which which are games that I still like own. Um, I think I own Tekken 3 and Tekken 2. I'm not sure if I own the first Tekken, and I'm not actually checking right now. But that was an interesting series, and Battle Arena Toshiden, not sure how you pronounce that. Like, I remember getting that on the PlayStation when it first came out. But one thing will always, have a place in my heart is the Sega Saturn, and I think it's mainly because I only had like this game on it, and I might have had like a platformer or something. I'm not even sure if I had more than one game on it. And that's what I get for owning or being able to play a system for about 2 months. The story behind that was, it actually wasn't mine. My uncle let me borrow his, and then he took it back. And I think, for the fact of the matter that there really weren't a lot of games released for the system, he just sold it back. Now, I really like, in terms of gameplay. This is probably a game that I would probably like, out of all the fighters that I have for the Sega Saturn, I would pick this one up the last. I'm like probably I would pick up like maybe the remix. There was Virtual Fighter Kids where they played in like their or they fought in their little chibi forms, and there were others. Now in terms of the Sega Saturn, I didn't really know that much. I didn't know that much, and I just wondered why like Funkoland was the only place that I knew that carried games for it. And this was around the time where there are other smaller shops that sold older games, but like um case in point, where I grew up in the games or the Funkoland I went to, there was a place, I think it was called Game Gallery or something like that, across the street from it. And as far as I know, it never held the Saturn. And then I was near KB Toys, and I found out why KB Toys never carried it, which in the grand scheme of things, when you look back at Sega in the 90s, it was latent with bad business decisions. And I think it was just the case that they really wanted to outdo the competition, and it really wasn't like it shouldn't have been their focus. So after getting a little frustrated with Virtual Fighter, I switched over to another game, Fighting Vipers, which there's a crossover game in existence, and it's called Fighters Mega Mix, where they have the Fighting Vipers characters and the Virtual Fighter characters, and you can play as those. So if you are, looking to get a Sega Saturn and you're looking for games to get, I would suggest Fighters Mega Mix over Virtual Fighter 2. And I think that's a consistent thing with people who are familiar with Virtual Fighter 2. I really think I think that due to some of the buggier issues with uh, Virtual Fighter 2, Virtual Fighter Remix was actually like mailed out to people who paid for Virtual Fighter 2. And I know for a while Virtual Fighter 2 came with all the consoles, so like I think you could mail in for uh, Virtual Fighter 2 Remix. I wasn't a Saturn owner at the time, so don't quote me on this. Um, but one thing I will say is that despite this being like very early 3D, Fighting Vipers is a really good game, and I would really recommend this game to other people. Um, I was really like, I don't play my Saturn that much, but since Saturn turned 20 years old, I decided to do this little two-part thing, and I'm gonna cover two more games in the next part, and talk about those. We'll talk a little bit about the Saturn and what have you. So the Saturn really kind of just flamingoed up when it came to the U.S. release of the game. Now, what 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 happened was, and this goes into what I'm going to title this video, Saturn Days. Originally, Sega Saturn had a release date for September, and it was on like a Saturday, and they were gonna name it Saturn Day for like their release, and it was gonna be great. It was gonna be epic. It was gonna be glorious. they announced it. That was like their public. That was like just their public announcement, and they were like, "Yeah, we're hyping this up." And then the unreleased PlayStation at the time also released, or also announced a release date a couple weeks apart from the Sega Saturn. I'm not sure which one would have came out first, but Sega of America felt like they needed to get a head start on the PlayStation, and it completely backfired. Um, according according to like a few things that I looked into, a few stories told, and what have you. Like this happened during E3, and they like unveiled the Sega Saturn, and they were like, "It's in stores now," and people were like, "What the fuck?" Uh, you know, because one, it it doesn't sound like people were ready for it. Um, you're saying that this console is in stores. Developers were still making launch titles for the September release, and they were pissed off about that too. Um, which of course it makes a lot of sense. You want to get in on this new system, and the guys who like basically make the system decide to release it a few months early. And I just feel like for as great as the Sega Saturn is, it should have just been held off. Mainly, who knows how that would have played out if Sega Saturn just stuck to its release date, what have you, what have you. Sega in the 90s, they really just were poor decision makers in terms of games, and in terms of development, and in terms of making business decisions. Um, you know, Sega Genesis was overdone with the add-ons, and as great as the add-ons were, as great as the Sega CD was, and as great of potential that the Sega 32X had, they were really implemented wrong. And the Sega CDX, which was their other attempt at doing the CD-based gaming, was released late. It was released really late. So whoever had a Sega, like whoever had a Sega CD had a Sega CD. Whoever had a Sega Genesis had a Sega Genesis. I don't think anybody saw payoff in the whole dual system thing. But it was a great idea. It was a fantastic idea. And I think if they went with that like earlier, or just, I don't know. I just think that Sony made some bad decisions, and it's hard to just be like, oh man, this could have been greater, because you know we only got a small number of games compared to a lot of the games released on the Sega Saturn, because Saturn was basically alive until like 1998 or 97, and we didn't get a lot of the JRPGs that were coming out in Japan on a Japanese Saturn, which at the time it makes a huge difference, because they were text based, and they were in Japanese, so like importing a game like that, you had to have command of the Japanese language. Um, and I mean, we got Shining Force 3, which, of course, we should have gotten more because there were three scenarios of the Shining Force 3 game. Um, there was scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3. We got scenario 1, which basically is a incomplete game. It was supposed to be released in installments, and since it wasn't well received here, and Sega of America kind of abandoned it, we didn't get that, and we didn't get a lot of the games that came out in Japan. Um, and a lot of people who have the Saturn now just tend to import it because there are some games that are just kind of easily imported and easily just played without having command of the Japanese language. Um, Now, in terms of the Sega Saturn, I I kind of wish, like, I kind of wish I saw more of it when I was young, and I kind of wish that Sega didn't do what it did, because it definitely did what Nintendo don't, because it didn't even stick to its own marketing plan. Um, it seemed like, to me, just based on everything that Sega released in the 90s, they were really focused on beating the competition. And it wasn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Competition's a good thing in terms of, I would say, economics and whatnot. But when it comes to, just having a plan and sticking to that plan, I think Sega could have done better, or at least Sega of America could have done better, and they could have at least supported the Sega Saturn a little bit more and given a little bit more faith into it. Because in Japan, like, they got Sega Sanshiro, which, dude, he's awesome. If they had those commercials released in the US, I think, I'm not sure, but I really think that people would pick up that game more. Um, but the Sega Saturn went on till 2000 in Japan, and like, it literally died. It literally died to give way to the Dreamcast. Like, that is amazing to me. Like, it just had such a better lifespan in Japan, and people were behind it. People believed in it, and there were just so many good games for it. And you know, now people over in the States are catching up to these good games, and they're giving people import advice and stuff like that. Um, but this is all I gotta talk about in part one of Saturn Days. Um, Look out for part two. I'm gonna show two more games, and I don't know, maybe if this picks up, I'll continue. See you later, guys.